There comes a time in certain sermons where you've laid out the main points of your lesson, and then you got to start pounding on the pulpit to drive them points home, especially when them points is pretty shaky to start with. And for Geisler and Turek, that time is now. Hey there, folks. Bertram, the Barely Bearable Atheist here, continuing our series on the book I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist by Norm Geisler and Frank Turek. We're about halfway through Chapter 12, entitled, Did Jesus Really Rise from the Dead? And Geisler and Turek has just wrapped up their case against secular alternatives to a literal physical resurrection. And now it's time to play hardball by demanding that skeptics provide evidence for non-supernatural scenarios. Quote, "It's one thing to concoct an alternative theory to the resurrection, but it's another thing to actually find first-century evidence for it. A theory is not evidence. Reasonable people demand evidence, not just theories. Anyone can concoct a theory to explain any historical event." End quote. Ooh, burn. Take that, Dawkins. Apologists just love to think that they's turning the tables on the skeptics. And this one's so juicy, you might not even notice how they stack in the deck by the way they specify the kind of evidence they require. Quote, "While skeptics has formulated numerous alternative theories to explain away the resurrection, there is no evidence from any first-century source supporting any of them. No one from the ancient world, not even the enemies of Christianity, has offered a plausible alternative explanation for the resurrection." End quote. And some of this is kind of subtle, like the way they capitalize the word resurrection to emphasize it. But notice the main thing that they's doing here is ruling out huge swaths of available evidence. They's demanding that the skeptics provide evidence, but the only evidence they's willing to accept is evidence that they's pretty sure don't exist. Namely, someone from the first century saying that they was eyewitnesses of disciples still in the body and apostles seeing visions of Jesus and early evangelists embellishing historical kernels of truth with miraculous details. Modern research into human psychology, archaeological discoveries like the Dead Sea Scrolls, even our current best understanding of the physical laws of the universe is off limits. If we was apologists trying to explain away contradictions in the Bible, Geisler and Turek could be more than happy to accept mere theories as if they was evidence. But since we's trying to explain the resurrection of Jesus in non-supernatural terms, the bar is set as high and as narrowly as they can put it. But even that ain't high enough to rule out the non-supernatural alternatives, as it turns out. Geisler and Turek tell us that the only alternative theory from the first century is Matthew's report that the Jews claimed that the disciples stole the body, which Matthew specifically identifies as a lie. But then again, Matthew was writing a gospel intended to convince people that Jesus really rose from the dead. So of course he would deny local first-century testimony corroborating the theft of the body. What's more, we know that Matthew himself was lying when he claimed that the Sanhedrin bribed the Roman guards to lie. Not only does he report details of a conversation that he weren't there to hear and that neither the Sanhedrin nor the soldiers would have shared with him, but his story claims that the Pharisees were exclusively concerned with the emptiness of the tomb. And if somebody you conspired to murder just done come back from the dead, the last thing on your mind would be what folks would think about a hole in the ground. So we know that Matthew was inventing a story that would only be plausible in the absence of an actual resurrection. And by the criterion of embarrassment, that's legitimate evidence both for disciples still in the body and for Jesus not actually rising from the dead. And there's also first-century evidence for other parts of the skeptical alternative to the resurrection, like apostles seeing visions. In 1 Corinthians 12, for instance, the Apostle Paul says, quote, I will go on to visions and revelations of the Lord. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know, God knows. And I know that this man was caught up into paradise, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know, God knows. And he heard things that cannot be told, which man may not utter. End quote. And as the context further down makes very clear, this quote-unquote man in Christ is none other than Paul himself, since he drops the third person and declares that God sent him personally a thorn in the flesh so that the greatness of the revelations wouldn't make him conceited. And obviously, it can't be eyewitness testimony if you ain't even sure whether or not you've got your physical eyes with you. The vision and revelation Paul is referring to here is clearly some kind of subjective, ecstatic experience, thus providing us with direct first-century testimony confirming that apostles got at least some of their visions and revelations of the Lord via internal, subjective, spiritual experiences, much like some believers still do today. So despite their attempt to disqualify most of the evidence and set the bar unreachably high, Geisler and Turek has failed to prevent skeptics from having evidence, including first-century testimony from witnesses who would be unlikely to lie about it. And if we set aside Geisler and Turek's arbitrary and prejudicial constraints on the evidence that we's allowed to consider, it's pretty easy to come up with the rest of the evidence, like the fact that believers tends to skew their wording in a way that gives the strongest possible impression of supernatural intervention, and believers also has a tendency to revise their stories to make them into better witness, as Geisler and Turek have frequently done in this very book that we're reviewing. For example, their conclusion that miracles is real is based on the observation that DNA molecules is complicated, and Geisler and Turek don't understand how the physical properties of molecules and atoms allow them to form into complex structures, and therefore Geisler and Turek conclude that God must have done it. Now that's a superstitious mental leap that really ain't all that different from finding an empty tomb and jumping to the conclusion that Jesus must have risen from the dead. Folks who desperately want to see miracles is going to see miracles, whether there's any actual miracles or not. Moving on, Geisler and Turek's next bit of pulpit pounding is to rehearse the tired old ad hominem fallacy of claiming that skeptics is simply unwilling to consider any evidence that suggests supernatural intervention. And they offer up a quote from John Dominic Crossan, which they think proves their point. Quote, "One has the right to say, I by faith therefore believe that God has intervened here, but it's a theological presupposition of mine that God does not operate that way." End quote. And here I think Crossan is committing a very common tactical error that a lot of skeptics fall into, and that's letting apologists set the terms of engagement as far as the wording of the supernatural is concerned. The thing about the supernatural is that everybody thinks they know what it means, but in fact it ain't really a definable term. The common concept of the supernatural is predicated on theistic assumptions, and the same goes for miracles. The theistic assumption is that God can do literally anything, except maybe sin. But that means that literally anything could be a miracle or could be attributed to a miracle. And whenever skeptics agrees to discuss miracles and the supernatural on those terms, they're just setting themselves up to be misrepresented as having an arbitrary bias against the supernatural. And that gives apologists an edge that they don't deserve to have. A better approach would be to leave questions of natural versus supernatural entirely out of the picture. Just limit ourselves to discussing whether or not something is consistent with what we can verifiably observe in objective reality. Whatever's consistent with objective reality is objective truth, and whatever is inconsistent with objective reality is objectively false. And that's a lot firmer footing for the skeptic because it directs the discussion away from personal prejudices and biases and focuses on objective reality. Plus, it puts the apologist on their back foot because if they tries to talk about miracles and the supernatural, they has to do so in terms of what we can verifiably observe in objective reality. If an apologist wants to complain that miracles can't be verifiably observed in objective reality by definition, that ain't the skeptic's problem. Things that ain't true can't be verifiably observed neither. And if the apologist wants to give miracles the same definition as things that ain't true, go right on ahead. Meanwhile, back to Geisler and Turek. They bring up 4 points which they claim establish a context in which an actual literal resurrection would be the most plausible explanation. Quote, Number 1, the theistic nature of this universe makes miracles possible. Number 2, ancient documents say miracles are to be expected. Number 3, historically confirmed eyewitness documents say miracles are actual. And number 4, additional confirmation. End quote. And yeah, this whole section of the book is just a rehash of all the mistakes they've been making since the beginning of the book, which I don't want to repeat here, but I do want to point out once again that this demonstrates the facility with which believers use their own ignorance, superstition, and wishful thinking to turn flimsy evidence or even no evidence at all into quote-unquote proof that their religious beliefs is true and valid. For example, from the Big Bang Theory, Geisler and Turek take the bit that seems to say time only extends a finite distance into the past. And from there, they jump to the conclusion that before the beginning of time, there was an eternal God who acted supernaturally to create time and space and matter and energy. Never mind that the phrase before the beginning of time is a self-contradiction. Never mind that the phrase nothing existed is literally nonsense. Never mind that if the past is finite and the universe has existed for all of it, that means the universe would have existed for all of time, and therefore no creator God would ever even have an opportunity to create it since it already existed at every moment in time. All Geisler and Turek cares about is getting to the part where they gets to say that the theistic nature of this universe makes miracles possible. Watching Geisler and Turek handle the evidence this way, it ain't unfair to suppose that first-century Christians would also have reached similarly extravagant conclusions on the basis of little to no evidence combined with their own ignorance, superstition, and urgent desire to validate their own religious faith, just like Geisler and Turek. And having jumped to such credulous conclusions, it ain't unfair to suppose that these early believers would have reported their experiences in terms that maximize the apparent legitimacy of their claims while omitting significant details that would undermine their story. Just like Geisler and Turek claims that the miracles has been reliably reported by historically confirmed eyewitness documents without mentioning the historically confirmed parts concern trivial details unrelated to the purported miracles, and that the gospel writers don't claim to have personally witnessed any of the miracles they're reporting, and that even the authorship of many New Testament documents is based on unreliable and biased testimony. The more you see how believers justify their faith today, the easier it is to see how they would have done it 2,000 years ago and how little evidence they'd require in order to do it. Next up, the dictum that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Quote, some skeptics might admit that the resurrection is possible, but they say it would require extraordinary evidence to believe it. That is, since the New Testament makes extraordinary claims, such as miracles, we must have extraordinary evidence in order to believe those claims. This objection seems reasonable until you ask, what does extraordinary mean? End quote. And this ain't as tricky a question as Geisler and Turek is going to make it out to be. In this context, extraordinary simply means evidence which is more consistent with the extraordinary claim than it is with a more ordinary alternative. For example, in the case of miracles, we would need evidence that was more consistent with a God existing and intervening in human affairs than it is with religious folks having beliefs that, in their mind, outweigh objective reality. Religious folks is having unrealistic and or extreme beliefs, and that's a pretty common condition. So we need evidence that was independent of religious belief that we could verify objectively and without having to believe in the religion. And that would be extraordinary evidence. But of course, Geisler and Turek ain't got that. So they's going to try and make it sound like the evidence they do have is extraordinary somehow, or else that the requirement for extraordinary evidence is unreasonable for some reason. Quote, if extraordinary means beyond the natural, then the skeptic is asking the resurrection to be confirmed by another miracle. How would that work? He would then demand a third miracle to support the second, and this would go on to infinity. End quote. And this almost sounds like a reasonable objection, but that's because we live in a world where miracles don't happen. Here, Geisler and Turek runs headfirst into the apologist's dilemma. They has to prove both that God intervenes in human affairs and that it's totally unreasonable to expect God to intervene in human affairs. Imagine a world where God loves folks as much as the Gospels claim he does. And because he loves us and wants to be with us forever, he hangs out with us. He shows up tangibly, visibly, audibly, and in person, in church every Sunday. He visits the hospitals and heals the sick, including amputees. He stops wars by miraculously preventing weapons from firing, and solves world hunger by raining down manna from heaven. If you go to a skeptic in a world like that with a claim that God has worked some particular specific miracle in your life, the skeptic might still want to see the evidence, but that evidence would be a lot easier to come by. You might take the skeptic to church with you so he could get confirmation directly from God that yes, he did perform that miracle. And because God was consistently, verifiably, personally present in objective reality, the skeptic would have sufficient evidence to justify his belief in your miracle. So no, it ain't unreasonable for skeptics to want miraculous evidence for miraculous claims. It only sounds unreasonable to believers because they knows from experience that God don't actually do miracles. Or at least deep down they knows it. Religious beliefs is different from actually knowing things. Anyways, Geisler and Turek next try the frankly silly argument that maybe extraordinary means repeatable in a laboratory, and therefore it's unreasonable because you can't repeat historical events in a laboratory. Yeah, duh. I'm surprised they wasted paper and ink on that one, unless it was a shout-out to young Earth creationists and their ridiculous notion that science is limited to only what you can repeat in a lab. But moving on. Quote, if extraordinary means more than usual, then that's exactly what we have to support the resurrection. We have more eyewitness documents and earlier eyewitness documents for the resurrection than for anything else in the ancient world. End quote. And of course, no, they don't. They just have spurious and exaggerated claims about the documents that they do have. So, 3 attempts to understand what extraordinary evidence means, and none of them even comes close to what it actually means. From there, they goes on to claim that atheists believe extraordinary things that they ain't got extraordinary evidence for because they believe that the universe exploded into existence out of nothing, and they ain't got no evidence for abiogenesis or evolution, which is all horse apples as we've seen before. And then they tries to argue that there's less evidence for Alexander the Great than for Jesus, and therefore it's hypocritical to demand more evidence in the case of Jesus than in the case of Alexander. Of course, to make that argument, they has to limit themselves to reviewing the dates on the surviving manuscripts of Alexander's biography, and to completely ignore evidence like coins, inscriptions, cities he's founded, many of which is named after him, the empire he founded, etc., etc., etc. But the very best part of this section comes in the very last paragraph. Quote, as we pointed out in Chapter 8, if God were too overt because of frequent miraculous displays, then he might, in some cases, infringe on our free will. End quote. And there's the apologist's dilemma again. God most definitely intervenes in human affairs, but it's unreasonable to expect him to intervene in human affairs. Divine intervention both makes it possible for us to be saved and makes it impossible for us to have the free will that we need to be saved. You know, I wonder if there's some kind of speed limit sign in heaven that tells God how many miracles per millennium he's allowed to perform before he's in violation of human free will. Like, what's the limit? Is it something like 10, or is it maybe 1,000? Does helping folks find their car keys count against the limit? What would happen if he went over it? Would we all lose our free will all at once, or only just certain folks? Skeptical minds want to know. And we're just about done here as far as chapter 12 is concerned. And that brings us to David Hume's argument that, quote, miracles cannot affirm any one religion because miracles are based on poor testimony and all religions have them. In other words, miracle claims are self-canceling, end quote. And just to be clear here, that's Geisler and Turek's paraphrase of Hume's argument, not a direct quote from Hume himself. And predictably, Geisler and Turek's rebuttal basically just says, nuh-uh, our miracles is real miracles, and also the Big Bang proves that only Judaism, Christianity, or Islam could be true, and our miracles are the best miracles, so we're the true, real religion. Sure, they said it fancier, but that's pretty much the gist of it. And that's it. Geisler and Turek spent all of chapters 9, 10, 11, and 12 trying to prove that the New Testament is a reliable, accurate, historically confirmed eyewitness testimony of the life, death, and literal resurrection of Jesus. And what they actually proved is that apologists today uses motivated reasoning, flexible standards of evidence, and a whole bunch of magical thinking in order to reach predetermined conclusions. Which just goes to show a lot of the New Testament can be explained non-supernaturally simply by assuming it was written by guys like Geisler and Turek. And I'm sure there's more that could be said, but that's going to wrap it up for me for today. Next time, we're going to start on chapter 12, in which Geisler and Turek is going to try and convince us that Jesus is literally God. Lucky us. Meanwhile, thanks for watching. And please be kind wherever possible.